Hari Om. Begin each day listening to the most auspicious sound in the universe. Yoga of Self-Control Meditation, Chapter 6, Shloka 5 and 6. Let a man lift himself by his own self alone, and let him not lower himself, for this self alone is the friend of oneself, and this self is the enemy of oneself.
Chapter 6, Shloka 5. Uddharet atmanatmanam natmanam avasadayet atmaiva hyatmano bandhuho atmaiva ripuratmanah.
The self is the friend of the self for him who has conquered himself by the self. But to the unconquered self, the self stands in the position of an enemy, like the external foe.
Chapter 6, Shloka 6. Bandhuratmatmanastasya yenatmaivatmana jitah anatmanastu shatrutve vartetatmaiva shatruvat.
Chapter 6, Shloka 5 and 6. When a man has attained yoga, then how the self is raised by the self from the countless evils of limited existence is explained. Man, in his misunderstandings, waits for the grace of the Lord to come to lift him from the present state to the higher within himself. Lord's grace is waiting to help, but it is the lack of self-effort on the part of the individual that deprives him the warmth of the grace. For example, a man sitting in a dark room on a bright, clear, sunny day complains there is no light and waits for the grace of the sun or sunlight to come in. He has to get up, separate the curtains and open the windows, when automatically the room is flooded with grace of the sun as sunlight. Man, if he wants to rocket himself to the greatest spiritual possibility lying dormant in him, has to raise the lower in himself to the greater perfection that is the true and the eternal core in himself. Most of us know what is good for us, but it is not lived in action. Similarly, intellectually, we may have a clear picture of what we should be, but mentally and physically, we behave just the opposite of our own ideal concept. We are also not conscious of this duality in us. Intellectually, we vividly know how we should be morally, ethically, physically, and socially, but mentally, at the level of feelings and emotions, we are carried away by our attachments and the pairs of opposites and behave like unintelligent, uncultured brutes. As long as we are not aware of the two opposite forces within us, religion cannot help us and we continue to suffer. Only on discovery of the duality playing in us, we can keep the lower nature as pure as the higher by employing the techniques laid out by religion for our own evolvement. Mind is the culprit which enchants us away from our own perfection. It distorts the ideal and pushes us for satisfaction through the senses. The lower in us requires to be trained first and then grow to come under the discipline of the higher for any progress to take place. The former can be achieved with the help from teachers and scriptures, but the latter has to come from self-discipline and self-effort alone. Becoming aware of the weakness is one part, but to substitute it with the opposite, something better and more profitable, is the other part. Finally, not falling back into the old rut is very important, warns the Lord. The lower can raise itself through various disciplines to the level of the higher, but the higher can only influence when the lower is available for its influence. So the mind alone can lift itself or not lift itself. In this sense, Lord says that this self alone is the friend of oneself, and this self is the enemy of oneself. When the mind doesn't want to come under the influence of the higher, then the self cannot help and so seems as if like an enemy. It all depends upon how we make use of our equipment. We have to accept the responsibility of blessing or damning ourselves depending upon how we employ the potentiality for our improvement, the chances for self-growth, and the strength to haul ourselves out of our misconceptions. The ego, through the identification with the equipment, drags one out in the fields of objects and beings to enjoy and suffer. To the extent it has withdrawn its delusory identification with the equipment, to that extent it comes under the influence of the nobler and divine. But where the little self remains as a rebel against the higher, to that unconquered self, the diviner self is as if an enemy in its attitude. Lord says that the higher self is the friend of the self for him who has conquered himself by the self. But to the unconquered self, the self stands in the position of an enemy, like the external 4. Learn more in the next shloka in the next video. To understand Gita, join Chinmaya Mission study group in your area. There are over 300 Chinmaya Mission centers in the world. Kindle Life is the first text prescribed in the scheme of study by Swami Chinmayananda himself. Watch Ranjot Kalra's videos on Kindle Life online. See this video clipping again and again till you can answer the following questions.